Hey everyone, how are you doing? We are now back and we're moving on away from crimes against persons, and we're going to finish up the semester talking about property crimes and then the few remaining areas of crimes that we're going to cover. So we're moving on now to chapter 11. So chapter 10, remember, covered 3 specific areas: sex offenses, assaultive offenses, and then offenses, confinement types of offenses. So that finished crimes against persons. And now we're moving on to property crime. So make sure that you're moving on to chapter 11. So we are going to talk about property crimes today. And we're going to break it down into 2 separate lectures. So we're going to talk about taking of property crimes, and then we're going to talk about invading and destroying property crimes. So just to get us thinking along these lines, I want you to think about how many property crimes that you can name. So if you had to think of property crimes, what are the different property crimes that you can name? So hopefully you thought of burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, arson, those kind of different crimes. So this is the property crimes time clock. So we looked at this when we talked about crimes against persons, and they use the uniform crime reports and they take all the crimes that are committed in a certain category, and then they divide it by how many minutes or seconds that there are in the year. When you do that, you can figure out that there's a property crime every 3 seconds, a burglary every 14 seconds, a larceny every 5 seconds, a motor vehicle theft every 28 seconds. So you can see there's quite a lot more property crimes than there are crimes against persons. So there's going to be a lot more of these types. Now, in order to understand property crimes, you kind of had to understand a couple concepts. So I want you to understand or distinguish between the concepts of what we call tangible property and intangible property. So tangible property is anything you can touch. So my clicker, my cup, my pencil, these are all things I can touch. These are all tangible property. But when you're talking about property crimes, it can also include things that are considered intangible property. So your cable, you can't touch your cable. It is a form of property, the cable, but you can't touch it. Or Netflix. Netflix is a form of property, but you don't touch Netflix, right? Or stocks or bonds. So those are what we call intangible. They're still property. You just can't touch them like you would something else. So like I said, we're going to break property crimes into 3 different categories. So taking of property crimes, destroying or damaging of people's property, and then we'll do invading people's property. So in this lecture, we're just going to talk about the taking of somebody's property. So taking of someone's property, what crime would this be? Greg is studying for an exam in the library. He gets up to go to the bathroom. While he is in the bathroom, Veronica walks over and takes his textbook. So what is the basic crime of taking something from someone else? Well, under common law, that was referred to as theft or larceny. So theft or larceny was defined as taking and carrying away property of another with the intent to permanently deprive the owner of possession. So you had to actually take it and carry it away. Now, carrying away doesn't have to be very far. It could be picking it up and putting it in your mouth. So there's no like distance or anything for carrying away. And taking and carrying away could all be part of the same action. You cannot steal from yourself. If you have interest or possession of it, then you own it, and you own it, then you cannot commit larceny or theft for anything that you own. So it always has to be property of another. And the bigger thing is you have to show you intend to permanently deprive the owner of that property. So not only is it an intentional crime, intentional taking and carrying away, so mens rea intentional, but you also have to show intend to permanently deprive the owner. So you have to do something with it that shows that you never intend to give it back. You need to keep it. So John gets up and gets a spoon, and while he's in the cafeteria, Carrie walks up to the table, takes his hamburger. As she's walking away, she takes a bite and says, "This is good." So can we prove larceny? So we have to show mens rea intentional. Well, yeah, she walked over and did it. So through her actions, we can show intentional. Taking and carrying away. She picks it up and puts it in her mouth. That's taking and carrying away. It's not her hamburger, it's his. And by biting it and chewing it, she clearly shows through her actions that she never intends to give it back. So yes, that could be a theft or larceny. Now, what about this? What if you see a car running in the street and I just drive it around the block and give it back? So I see your car, it's just sitting there, you're not in it, you have it started, you get out to do something and you leave it running and I jump in, drive it around the block and come back. Is that larceny or theft? And it's not, because you can't show permanently depriving the owner of the property. It's more of what we call a joyriding. So in a lot of states, they had to create a separate crime called joyriding because it does not fit the actual definition that we give for larceny or theft, because you cannot prove the element of permanently depriving the owner of the property. Now, what about this? Joe is in a store looking around. He gets in a crouching position where a security guard watches him place a set of wrenches in his bag. And then he proceeds to walk toward and going out the door. Is this larceny yet? And then compare it to this. What if the person removed the price tag sensors and devices designed to set off an alarm if walking through detected equipment from a leather coat? And then he puts on the coat and walks through the exit door. So the question is, what is the difference? So in Joe, if he hasn't walked through the door yet, you can't show that they permanently intend to deprive the owner yet. They did take it and carry it away and it's not theirs, but they may just be putting it in their bag to carry it to the register so that they didn't have to carry it in their hands. So sometimes you have to wait a little longer before you can actually arrest them for larceny or theft until you know for sure that they plan on permanently depriving the owner. Now, in the second case, you have a much stronger case because they actually did remove devices that were intended to detect if people take it out the door. So that would be a stronger case for larceny or theft because of that additional step. And that could be used as additional evidence to prove larceny. What about this? Greta is standing in front of a swanky restaurant sign that says free valet parking. Kurt drives his car up to her. Greta asks him if he would like her to park the car. He says yes and hands her the keys to his Porsche. She gets in and drives straight to a chop shop. Is this larceny? So is it taking and carrying away? Yes. Property of another? Yes. To permanently deprive? Yes. But the problem is, in this case, Kurt gave it to Greta. He handed the keys over to Greta, free will. He handed it to her. So that can be problematic because it wasn't really an unlawful taking. It was given to her. But you have to think, well, okay, that's still something. What could it be? So it doesn't fit that perfect definition of larceny. So we had to include it under something else. So it falls more under what we would call a false pretenses or fraud. Okay, so this is when you obtain someone's property under false information or misrepresentation. So yes, the person gave it to you, but they only gave it to you because you deceived them with false information. So it may not fit perfectly under larceny, but we're still going to be able to charge them with something. It's just going to fall under a different crime of like a false pretense or fraud. What about this? Franklin is the accountant for Corporation USA. After reviewing the financial records, he decides that he can transfer a few $1,000s to his own account and the company will never miss it. So we have to go through with larceny. So unlawful taking and carrying away. Well, it's not an unlawful taking because he has legal access to that money and he is allowed to take it out of that bank account. But he's only allowed to use it for certain things, and he is using it for unlawful purposes. But again, it doesn't fit our perfect definition of larceny. So then what happens? We have to, again, think of a different crime. So they're not going to get away with it, but it has to fall under a different crime. And this is the crime of embezzlement. So embezzlement is having lawful possession. So you're allowed to have it. You're allowed to take it. And you're allowed to have the other person's property, but you're using it for an illegal purpose. So you're illegally transferring that property to yourself or to some other person for your own benefit. So that's embezzlement. So it doesn't fit perfectly in larceny. So then we're just going to lump it in another crime called embezzlement. What about this? Jones threatens to reveal that Harrison has AIDS in the future unless he transfers all of his savings to Jones. Is this larceny? So it's taking and carrying away, and it's done with a threat of something. Okay, so it's not a perfect larceny because the victim is still handing it over to the person, but they're only doing it because of some fear of force or threat or something, like not so much force, but fear of them disclosing sensitive information about you. So it doesn't, again, fit larceny perfectly, but it does fall under what we call extortion, or sometimes you may have heard it called blackmail. So this is obtaining something of value from another because of fear of future embarrassment or disgrace. So this isn't physical force. This is they're just going to disclose something about you that you don't want disclosed. You're having an affair, or you have some disease you don't want anybody to know, something like that. Then that, if somebody is using that information to get you to hand over property, that falls under extortion or blackmail, if you've heard blackmail, but we call it extortion in New York. Okay, so Joe goes over to Kathy's house and tells her that he has a really good deal on iPads. He says that he will sell her an iPad for $50. He says that he found a place to buy them cheaply. When Kathy looks at it, she sees that the serial numbers have been scratched off the back. She buys it anyway. So again, larceny, taking, carrying away property of another, permanently deprive. Well, she thinks she's buying it, so she doesn't think she's permanently depriving anybody of it because she thinks she's lawfully getting it. But the question is she? And if you know that the person giving it to you does not have lawful possession of it, you can actually be charged with receiving stolen property. So this is acquiring possession of property that has been stolen. Now, in general, this is a super hard crime to prove because you have to show that the person that possesses it knew it was stolen property, and that's often very hard to prove. So in my example, I tried to show that by showing that it was super cheap. You can't buy an iPad for $50. And also the fact that the serial numbers were scratched off. So you would have some evidence of this, but this would normally be a super hard crime to charge. So, what about in New York? In New York, we call it criminal possession of stolen property. So we don't have receiving stolen property. If you're looking for this crime, it would fall under criminal possession of stolen property. So when you look at all of the different crimes, larceny is our common law offense. And then because it was so specific, we had to break it down into all of these more specific larceny crimes. So these are all the concept of taking property, but for different ways and different means of doing it. So that's why we have all these. So false pretenses, embezzlement, stolen property, we talked about shoplifting. Some have specific crimes for that: looting, grand theft auto, identity theft, so stealing social security numbers and person information about person's identity, computer fraud, credit card fraud, and then intellectual property, which we'll talk about at the end of the next lecture. Okay, so what I want you to do is stop the video and try to figure out which common law taking crimes each of these would be. And then when you're ready, start the video again, and I'll click to the next slide and you can see if you got it right. So hopefully you did that. And this is what I would have written for each of the taking properties. So hopefully you got the same answer. Okay. Now, let's look specifically at New York. So New York calls it larceny. Not all states call it larceny, but we in New York do call it larceny, okay? And it's going to be sections 155 to 155.45. So in New York, what I want you to do is look up the term larceny, okay? So find larceny. I gave you the sections here, 155, look it up, and then look how it's broken down. One of the things you'll see in the little mini table of contents at the beginning of the article is that there's two categories. So you have petty larceny or petit larceny and grand larceny. So those are the two main categories of larceny that we have. Now, another thing I want you to look at is section 155.00. In this section, it defines property. This is going to be really, really important because this is going to tell us what actually falls under the term of larceny. If you read that section, you see that it does in fact include tangible property that you can touch, and it also includes intangible property like cable or Netflix or things like that. Now, when you're looking at that mini table of contents, you will see that we have multiple degrees of larceny. How do we determine the degree? It's often determined by value. So how much was the property worth at the time it was taken? So that's an important factor you have to remember when you're trying to prove the crime of larceny. You have to remember you're always going to have an expert or somebody testify to the value of the property, because that's how you're going to determine which degree of larceny. It's on the value of the product. How do you establish value? Again, you have to call an expert. So if it's a jewel, you would have to have a jeweler come and testify to the value, or an estimate of something. If it was services like cable, you'd have to calculate how long they were stealing it or taking it and calculate the value of what that service would have been. So you're going to have an expert testify at trial about the value. So what common law crimes fall under New York larceny? Sorry, when you look at section 155.05, and then specifically at subsection 2A and 2E, you will see there are certain offenses that we called separate offenses, but under New York, we're going to lump under larceny. So those crimes that we talked about, false pretenses or fraud, embezzlement and extortion, those are all going to fall under larceny in New York. So we are not going to have separate crimes for those. We're going to lump them under larceny. So they would also fit right under the larceny statute based on the amount or value that each of those things had associated with them. So don't look for false pretenses or embezzlement or extortion in the penal law, because they're going to be included under larceny. So you should try this. So shut off the video, read through this, and decide which degree of larceny you would charge for each of these things. Okay. So, sorry, I had to stop it for a second. Back. Okay, so hopefully when you looked at those, you saw that if you are just stealing property, and since it was a small amount, remember larceny is based on value, it's just going to be petty larceny. But if you do the taking from a person, so off of their possession, even though it's a very small amount of value, it's going to raise to a higher level of larceny. So now we're going to grand larceny in the fourth, because you're actually taking the property from a person. So why would you think that that would make it a higher degree? Because it becomes more dangerous. If you're actually taking something off somebody's person, it becomes a more dangerous offense. Now, let's just touch on a couple other property crimes. What if you fake someone's signature on a check? So that is a property crime. That is going to be forgery. So you sign somebody else's name on a check. And then what happens when you try to go and cash that check? So cashing that check is going to be a separate crime. And we call that uttering a forged document. And in New York, we call it criminal possession of a forged instrument. Okay. So the actual signing is a crime, and then trying to cash it is a different crime. What about this? David is walking down a dark alley when Lisa jumps out from behind the dumpster, hits David in the head, and grabs his wallet. So is this a larceny? Well, yeah, it is a taking of property of another with the intent to permanently deprive. But the question is it even worse? Is it even more than a larceny? And the answer is yes, because of the level of force or the threat of force that you're using to get the property turns it into what we would call a robbery. Some places call robbery crimes against persons because you actually have to harm a person to take the property. We just have so many crimes against persons that I lump it under property crimes, but it's still taking property of another by force or threat of force. Now, what if Greg walks up to Yuri, points a fake gun at Yuri, and Yuri knows that the gun is fake? Is that robbery? And the answer is no. The threat has to be real. The victim has to truly believe that force is going to be used against them. If the person knows it's a fake gun, then it's not really a level of force that's being used or a threat of force. Okay, so now we're going to look at robbery in New York. So hopefully you look up robbery. And you can see we have multiple degrees of robbery. So how many degrees of robbery do we have and how do they differ? So if you read through the different degrees, how do they differ? How do you know which degree to choose from? Well, here's your little reference sheet. And I posted the reference sheet along with the other property crimes. You can print it out and have it with you. So any forcible stealing is going to be robbery. But if you add an injury or a weapon, then it's going to make it a higher degree, okay? So depending on the level of injury, just like we did with assault, you have physical injury versus serious physical injury, that's going to affect it. And then do you have a fake weapon, but you're still putting the person in fear that it's a weapon, or do you have a real weapon? So that's going to be a different factor. It also may differ based on the number of people. So if there's multiple people committing the robbery, it's going to be a higher degree. So that is another factor you want to take into consideration when you're deciding which degree of robbery. So using the New York robbery statutes for second and third degree, try to figure out what each of these would be. So stop the video, write your answers down, and then when you're ready, start the video again. So hopefully you did that, and this is what the answers would be. So the first one, robbery first, then robbery second, then robbery third, then robbery second, and robbery first. Okay. So what about this? Wanda walks into the Bank of Batavia, points a gun at Bonnie, bank teller, and tells her, the bank teller, she wants all the money. Is this a New York State robbery? Well, this actually turns into a federal crime. As long as there's a bank involved, banks are insured by the FDIC. It's a federal depository that protects them against losses. And since it's a federal insurance, if you rob a bank, it becomes a federal crime. So it would not be a state crime if you rob a bank. It now becomes the federal crime of robbery. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, are what we call white collar crimes. So this is another form of taking crimes. So what are white collar crimes? White collar crimes are property crimes that are committed by people that are considered respectable or high in society in their occupation or their job. So these are people that have a position of power and they use and abuse that power to take property from other people. So generally the motive for these white collar crimes is going to be money or more power. So they can fall under two different categories. Occupational crime is going to be a crime based on somebody's occupation. So if you're the CEO of a company and you're stealing money from that company, that's an occupational crime. So that could be one. Or corporate crime is when you're having the corporation itself commit illegal activities. So some examples, Bernie Madoff, he was a financial advisor and he was lying to people and got them to give him lots of money, and he was just stealing their money and not investing it. And then you have Love Canal, where, so Bernie Madoff would be, it would be the first example would be this occupational crime because he was using his occupation to commit a crime. Love Canal was the corporation was committing a crime. The corporation was dumping waste. This is in Niagara Falls, and it was just dumping waste into this area and it was seeping into the ground. And then they built a neighborhood on top of it and people were dying because of the waste. So that was a corporate crime. Okay. Now, another famous one is the Ford Pinto case. So there was this car that was a Ford Pinto, and they took the gas tank and they put it in the back of the car. And they knew that if the car got rear-ended, that it would explode, because they did all these tests and it exploded. And so what they did, though, they knew this was happening, but they did a cost benefit analysis. And they said, if they just pay out for people that are hurt. So if we just say, not everybody's going to get rear-ended, but the ones that do, we'll just pay the people. So if you were seriously burned or you had any death, then it would cost $200,000 per death, $67,000 per injury, and then you have to pay for the car. If you add those and estimate, it's only going to cost the company about $49.5 million. But if we call all these cars back and replace the gas tank, it's going to cost us $139 million. So the corporation said, well, we're just going to pay for people dying and allow this to happen. And you can't do that. You can't allow your products to cause death, even if it costs less money. So that is a form of a white collar or corporate crime. Some other crimes that fall under white collar crimes would be like a tax evasion. So you don't pay your taxes when you're supposed to. False advertising. We don't allow companies to lie about their product. They can't falsely tell the customer certain things. Mail fraud. So if you try to commit fraud or misrepresentation through the mail. Securities fraud. So if you're a company and you're trying to sell your stocks, your securities are stocks, and you're lying about your company, that's a crime. And then insider trading is when you have special knowledge because you're in that company and working, and then you use that to buy and exchange stocks. And it's information that an average everyday person wouldn't have. That's insider trading. You're not allowed to do that either. So those are different forms of white collar crimes. White collar crimes cost us a lot of money. All of them added together cost more than almost all the regular crimes that we've talked about. So the federal government has really tried to crack down on these forms of crimes. So they passed a couple of federal laws. So we have the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and we have the White Collar Crime Penalty Enhancement Act. I'm not going to ask you specifics about what each of them require, but just understand that these are two laws that the federal government have enacted to try to cut back on the ability of people to commit these white collar crimes. Okay, so that's all of the taking crimes. If you go to my GCC, I posted some problems up there that you can work on and try to solve, and then you can look at the answers and make sure that you're understanding New York's property crimes. So these are just the problems, okay? So they're all on that sheet, and you can look at that sheet for them. Okay, so that's the end of the first lecture for this week, and I will be back to talk about destroying and invading of property crimes. See you soon.